This is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to go and take a look at the newer user aspect of Fantasy Grounds. A lot of people are coming in, they have a lot of confusion over what they're getting and what sorts of things that you can expect from the platform. First and foremost, when you first join with Fantasy Grounds, you're going to set up an account on the website. So over here on the right, I'm logged in as my name Laren here. And then on the top, there are menus here that'll help guide you through some of the steps. So one of the first considerations is the type of user that you're going to be. If you're going to be the host or the player, or perhaps just a casual user. If you're going to just join a game and try out Fantasy Grounds, all you need is the free demo. You don't need really anything else. One caveat to that is if you go and install Fantasy Grounds for the first time, you want to make sure that you allow the firewall through. So if you're using a PC and the little pop-up comes up when you first install Fantasy Grounds, you want to allow it to happen. Otherwise, when you connect to a game, you might have problems with maps loading, or you may not be able to connect at all. So those are considerations for all users. If you're going to install Fantasy Grounds for the first time, make sure that the firewall is allowing Fantasy Grounds through, because it might still allow you to connect through Fantasy Grounds. However, it may not let the data from Fantasy Grounds go back and forth between the host and the client. So that's something that comes up quite a bit. You'll get one person that will say, hey, I can't see the maps, or I only see my token, and I get a black screen. Well, that's generally, if it's only one person, that's generally the culprit, is that you either have something blocking the application, or perhaps even a security protocols in place. It's not allowing Fantasy Grounds to write to your hard drive, or perhaps there are some other complications, such as your internet service provider might be blocking. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong or that can be problematic with networking. But generally, if it's just one player, that's where I would start, is make sure that the firewall and the antivirus exceptions are fixed, and then also make sure you have the current version of Fantasy Grounds. Once in a while, a new player won't update the demo client, which I recommend. So if you get connected to Fantasy Grounds, before you connect to the table, talk to your game master and consider updating the software. It's really not too bad when you actually bring up the interface after you have it installed. But down on the bottom right, you can force update this. So you can click on check for updates. It will pop up a small updater window. It'll scan the library and it will detect if there's any changes made to the base client. Generally not, but this mostly is helpful for people that have content. But even if you are a demo user, sometimes they do update the base platform. So you want to update that before you connect to your GM, but make sure you talk to them about it first, because you want to make sure you're all on the same page. When you use a browser-based application such as Roll20 or Foundry, you don't normally have to worry about that. That's all done in the portal. But as far as Fantasy Grounds goes, it's an actual computer app, so it has to be updated occasionally. Once in a while, you'll see a little logo pop up, or red. This check for updates will turn red. Generally, that means there's an update. That doesn't mean you have to. Sometimes it's not good to update because your GM hasn't updated yet and he doesn't want to, because he's worried about maybe one of his extensions breaking or something. So you want to make sure that you check with your game master before you update. And if you're the game master, you need to communicate that to your players that you're going to update, and you'd like everyone else to do the same before the next session. Generally, updates roll out on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, depending on what's going on. Normally, the updates are just incremental fixes, like just small things that needed to be updated within the modules or the content. But every now and then, when you get a version update, that's a bigger update, it'll change the version number. So right now we're at 4.3.8, but when you go to like 4.3.9 or even 4.4, that's a major update. So that's something that will give you a warning. It'll tell you that once you update the internet and all those things will be a little different in the actual interface. Those are the sort of things that you need to pay attention to, especially if you're the host. So once you have the client installed, you're going to go into the settings and you want to enter your credentials from the website. So the website password and your client password are the same. If you have a license key, you can also enter it here, and then you would put your username in and your password for the website. And once you do that, you click on login and then save. And it will save the settings. You don't normally have to mess with that once you've done that once. And then you can go ahead and hit update if you've made any recent purchases. So this is something you got to kind of take in consideration when you first buy Fantasy Grounds. If you buy a license, you're going to have to update it so it will pull in the changes. If you purchase your content on Steam, you will also need to go to the application on the website to synchronize your account. So if I go to help, there is a section here that will help you with connecting. So if you go to the store, you got Paizo account synchronization. So if you are a Paizo user and you have digital content on the Paizo store, if you link both of the accounts together, the Paizo online store and Fantasy Grounds store, you can take advantage of some discounts between the PDFs and the Fantasy Grounds content. And then there's also a Steam account sync. So if you come over here, you're going to put in your Steam account credentials or whatever it asks you for, and then you want to hit refresh Steam purchases. And what will do is it'll pull from Steam and it will verify that you've paid for whatever content. However, once you start buying on Steam, you want to stay there because of the bundling pricing. So if you keep switching between Fantasy Grounds and Steam, the bundle pricing is going to get messed up. So you want to either stick to one or the other. The benefit of Steam is that you have localized pricing for your region. So if you live in Brazil or in France or even in Malaysia, you're going to get the local pricing for that region through Steam. The other thing is if you have a gift card, like maybe you got a birthday present, you got a $100 gift card, you wanted to buy Fantasy Grounds through Steam, then I would just stay through Steam. The main benefit, though, is the cost for localization for when you're going to purchase it. So you're not paying the United States prices when you live in Mexico or something like that. So it'll help offset that. But if you're in the US, there's really not too many other reasons why you'd have to go through Steam unless you have Steam dollars and all kinds of things already accumulated. The other advantage is it kind of keeps track of how long you've used Fantasy Grounds. I don't know how accurate that is, but it gives you an idea of how many hours you put into it. Generally, though, when you first start, you want to synchronize your Steam account if you purchased anything through the actual Steam website. And all the Steam website does is it just hosts your password. It gives you another way to purchase Fantasy Grounds, and it just kind of keeps your library all in one place. There really is no benefit and there is no reason to have Steam. Actually, once you start Fantasy Grounds, you don't have to leave Steam open. You can actually close it down. There's no reason to have it on unless you want to keep track of the hours. So this is just one step that you might have to do if you are a Steam user. And if you make a major purchase again in the future, you want to come back here again and click on refresh purchases when you purchase on the Steam store. That way the Fantasy Grounds will know what you've purchased. It will be up to date, and then update Fantasy Grounds. I've seen a lot of people go on and they're like, I don't see my stuff. Well, it's probably likely that they didn't come back here and refresh. Now, if that doesn't work, you want to remove your Steam link or go back to Steam and make sure you have the proper account. I've seen where people have used 2 different Fantasy Grounds accounts and 2 different Steam accounts, and they get out of sync, so they don't remember which account they used to register and which account they used to purchase the content. So make sure you're in the correct Steam account and the correct Fantasy Grounds account. Otherwise, it's not going to work. There's been quite a few people who have had that problem. So you want to make sure that you have the proper account set up and that they are linked together. And if you can't remember which, write it down before you move on. So also going back to the home page, you have the demo, you have a standard license, and you have an ultimate. Each one of these, the standard and ultimate, have a subscription model, or you can buy it all at once. It really depends on what your needs are, your budget, and how much you want to invest. So the standard license just gives you the ability to basically buy stuff on the store. You can also host your own sessions, create characters, like if you were just a player and you wanted to build your own characters, you can buy your own content, your own dice, that sort of thing, and just kind of have a small collection so that you can at least log in without needing another host and build your own content. That's one of the benefits of having a standard account. If all of your other friends also have standard accounts, you guys can all connect to each other and play. So that's a way that you can actually lift the burden of this other cost here. This license for the Ultimate is $150 or $149, and the other one's $39. So basically $40 and $150. So if you don't want to pay for it all, but you're still going to run the games, you can ask your players to buy their own standard license. They don't have to buy all the books, but they can definitely just buy a license. That just allows them to connect to you without any hassles. However, if you buy an Ultimate license, nobody else has to buy anything, and you can just have them use the demo account, and then you would obviously be footing the bill for the Ultimate. The other thing you can do is do the subscription model. I think this standard one is like $5 a month. The Ultimate is $10 a month. You eventually, it'll pay for itself, the Ultimate, in the long run. But in the short term, if you just want to check out Fantasy Grounds, you can buy it on the Fantasy Grounds store. If you use it through Steam, the policy is different. But if you buy it through the Fantasy Grounds store, within 30 days, if it's something you're not going to use or you don't like it, you can ask for a refund. So if nothing else, you can try it out. You can buy a couple books. If it just isn't for you and you're not gelling or connecting with it very well, you can always write to customer service, and more than likely 99% of the time they're going to give you your money back within 30 days. So that's a pretty decent policy. Also, sometimes when you start a new subscription, you're going to get 3 months at the price of one. So you might get a price break for the first few months. Once in a while, they'll have a discount like that. So if you wanted to start a new account and you were going to try out a subscription, they offer to where when you first start, you can get like 3 months at $10. And that will be something that you can check out at your leisure. And that way you're not really paying out a bunch of money. And if you just want to try it out and you don't want to sink a bunch of dollars into it, regardless of what rule set your favorite is, the D&D and the Pathfinder 2, and I think there's a couple others that actually have some minimal content. And there's also some one-shot adventures that are kind of self-contained, so you don't have to buy a bunch of stuff. So, for instance, I'm going to speak on Dungeons & Dragons because I know that the most. So when you buy Dungeons & Dragons content, you can actually just buy like the Fantasy Grounds version of Lost Mine of Phandelver, and that actually comes with the monster manual, the monsters. It has 5 pre-gens and then the adventure. So you can actually just use that particular adventure to start off just to see how things go. And then if you like it, then you can go and start buying all the rule books and everything else. So if I go and search for Lost Mine, it's already here. It's like $15. It quite often goes on sale. At least a couple times a year, it goes down to almost $10. And that's another thing you'll notice on Fantasy Grounds is every week there will be some sales. So if I go to the store page and you look at the first couple pages, these are either on sale or new items. So like the Fantasy Companion for Suede is $20, whereas before it was like $25. These discounts vary depending on what you already own and how much of the content for a particular rule set you're invested in. So if you have all the D&D content, you also get a small discount for owning all the content. And if you're just going to add a new adventure or a new rule book, you'll get another little discount on top of it. So that's another benefit of, when you start collecting content and you start buying modules, eventually it pays off and you'll get all kinds of discounts and such. So here there's a wizard themed dice that's on sale. It's usually $10. This week it's $8. So if you pay attention to these sales pages, you can actually piece together a pretty cheap setup of different rule books. So you don't have to necessarily go out and buy everything at once. If you're going to buy anything, just buy the standard core rule book and maybe a small one-shot adventure. And in some cases, you can just get by with just the adventure. So it really depends on what your needs are, but it's something that you'll have to decide as you go. You don't necessarily have to do it all at once. There are options, though, if you want to do that. If you're just someone who has some coin to drop on role-playing games, and if you go to the store, there's a bundle pricing that you can just fork out a bunch of money and get everything, but you get a discount. Like there are some cases where you might get a slight discount, so 15% off a listed sale price. So that's not bad. So this, if you went and purchased everything on here, and then you got it would give you the 15% off. So it's kind of worth it when you're buying in bundles. Um, just depends on what your needs are, your budget, of course. And there are bundles for some major stuff here. So you got Paizo bundles, Starfinder, Pathfinder, Shadow the Demon Lord, Traveler, and then you have some map packs that are set up that way. You have the Deadlands bundle. You have all these token bundles. So there's quite a few bundles available on the store. Now, not every rule set has a bundle, just those that are mentioned. So once you have the client installed and once you're happy with your resources, make sure that you understand that the Atlassian is a portal, a customer portal, where you can look for things to help you out with Fantasy Grounds. So besides the community and our Discord and Fantasy Grounds Academy and the official forums, you also have an Atlassian. It is searchable. It does have some quick start guides, how to install, setting up and updating. This is actually pretty valuable. When I first started looking at this, I didn't think it was that great, but they update it all the time. There are some things that are a little bit behind that need to be updated, such as the character wizard for D&D 5e that needs to be updated to the new version. But other than that, most of the stuff's pretty valid. And it does have some individualized guides for certain rule sets like D&D and Pathfinder and those sort of things. Also, there's some troubleshooting articles here. So one of the things I had mentioned earlier is your networking troubleshooting. So when you come to the networking troubleshooting, it takes you through a bunch of things to check before you panic. And one of them is your bandwidth, also firewalls, antivirus, ad blockers, parent controls, those sort of things. And it tells you how to whitelist or create an exception so that you'll be allowed to allow Fantasy Grounds through your computer in case you're having connectivity issues. So there's all kinds of helpful things on the Atlassian. This is kind of like the support portal. And if you don't like that, you can always go to the main Fantasy Grounds website. And if you go to forums, you can check to see what's happening. So today there was an update. So the City Hall is where a lot of the new, more recent updates have been added or changed or fixed. And then the tavern is just kind of a basic discussion. And then you have the House of Healing for Fantasy Grounds Unity, and then there's one for the Forge, but I guess they took away the Unity one. There used to be one here for Classic, but now it's only Fantasy Grounds. So they don't support Classic anymore, really. I mean, you can still ask questions about it, but it's really not something that you would really have to discuss a whole lot more of because they don't support it anymore. So they just recently removed the old Classic version for the help. But this is where you report and discuss problems that you're having with Fantasy Grounds. The Forge is for their online community. So if you want to buy stuff that the community makes, you can go to the Forge, which is another storefront, and you can buy community developed content. So if I go to the Fantasy Grounds Forge, you can buy gold, which is essentially money, and you can buy maps and tokens and all kinds of stuff. And then there's even extensions and things that kind of enhance what the platform can do. So my advice on that is to kind of get used to the vanilla version of it before you start adding a bunch of third-party content, such as extensions and utilities that change the way Fantasy Grounds works. So here you have like I said, you have your House of Healing, your support. You have the Forge, which is mostly for Forge developers, people are creating content, or people are having problems accessing the store. And then the laboratory is where you can kind of look to see what's happening in the development cycle of Fantasy Grounds. So there are some things where when they have testing going on and when they're adding new features, this is where you would come to look to see what they're working on. So like this one, for instance, they're working on certain scripts for the dice tower, and then they'll list some major changes that'll go into the test version of Fantasy Grounds, and they'll test it out for a few weeks or a couple weeks, and then they'll release it generally after at least within a month. So these are just kind of where you would go if you want to know what they're working on. A lot of people say, oh, there's no roadmap. I have no idea what they're doing. But if you actually come to the laboratory, this will show you what they're working on currently. And that shifts and changes all the time. That's why they can't print any sort of, comprehensive release, because they have to switch around and change priorities all the time. And maintaining that would become a nightmare. So going back to the forums, you also have a place where you can look for games. There are the Fantasy Grounds Game Days, which is sponsored by Fantasy Grounds, and it's also run by a couple people that I know personally that do a really good job. Looking for groups is where you can post games and such and sign up for games. And then there's some Pathfinder and Starfinder specific Adventures League. And then if there's any conventions coming up, this would be potentially listed here. So these would be virtual conventions such as Fantasy Grounds, FG Days, those sort of things. And then they have FG Con, which just happens every now and then. Down below that are all the different game systems that are supported. Down on the very bottom in the other games, these are probably the less popular ones, but that doesn't mean they're bad or good. It just they've kind of broken it down into smaller groups. But some of the more newer popular rule sets kind of have their own thread. So if you're looking for something specific to a rule set, it'd be better to start there and then go to the forums if you're having actual Fantasy Grounds issues. If you're having issues with rules or how the rules interface with Fantasy Grounds, I'd start here first. And then down below are some create and share areas. There's a workshop and then an armory where you can share your content that you're creating for free, and they don't have to, you just want to make sure they're not copyrighted and that sort of thing. And then here's the House of Healing archive for Fantasy Grounds Classic. So it's still there, but it's actually, it's been kind of relegated because they don't provide as much support for that anymore. So nonetheless, this is just your resources. Now when you actually go to Fantasy Grounds, the actual platform, this has already been updated, so I'm going to go ahead and launch Fantasy Grounds. And what will happen is it will go back to the main screen, the launcher. And really, depending on if you're the player or the host, the sequence is a little different. I'm going to do this as the host, assuming that the person who's looking at this video is the person who purchased the content. So when you want to start something new, you could click on Create Campaign, give it a name. So maybe you would do New Campaign, something like that. And then you would pick the rule set. So I'm going to do D&D, but as you can see, there's a bunch of other rule sets on here. Not all rule sets show up on here until you buy it. So there are probably a couple dozen that do show up in this list, but like things like Vaesen, Alien, and some of the other third-party and the smaller rule sets, when you buy those, the actual start doesn't come up at all until you buy it. So just remember that if you're looking down this list and wondering where the other rule sets are, like Call of Cthulhu, this doesn't really show up here unless you buy the rule set. So it just depends on how it's licensed, how it's developed, and what you're getting with it. So most of these will have some sort of gear or startup items, not really anything great, kind of very minimal, but it's something that might get you started if you haven't purchased anything yet and you just have a license. So just remember that just because you have a license does not necessarily mean that you're getting anything with it. You're going to have to buy modules or make your own or whatever, but at least you'll have the base connectivity, and you'll have some core stuff in some rule sets, depending on which one it is. But I'm just going to call this new campaign, and actually I'm going to put D&D in front of it because I want to make sure I can differentiate the folders on the back end of Fantasy Grounds. So when I start a new campaign, I'll know which campaign and which rule set. Because if you play more than just D&D and you have a bunch of folders on the back end, so if I'll click on this little icon here, this is the back end of Fantasy Grounds, and there's a campaign folder. So if you come through here, I have tons and tons of folders here. And if I don't label those properly, it's going to be hard for me to remember which one it is that I last went in. And then while we're back here, you also have a folder for extensions. Mostly third-party extensions you can update through the Forge. There are a couple that are left over on the DM's Guild that are going to remain there. They're not going to the Forge, but most of the older extensions are now on the Forge, so you don't have to necessarily go and hunt them down to update them. The only one I know of is the Critically Awesome Essentials. That's about the only one I know that actually it's really just the one that I can think of off the top of my head that would require you to manually download it and install it. And generally, you want to remove the older one too. You want to avoid doubling up on extensions if you can. You have an images folder where you can put all your maps and your handouts. There's a modules folder where you would put in any third-party modules or the modules that you're creating, which is like third-party. You have a portraits area where you can add different portraits for your game, so you can have some really cool portraits instead of just the generic ones. And then you have a tokens area where you can put all your third-party tokens. So this is the top level of Fantasy Grounds, this folder. You access that by clicking on this folder icon. You generally don't have to mess with it unless you're adding content. And then over here in the campaigns area, each one of these campaigns can have its own images, tokens, and portraits. So it just depends on where you put these things and what it's for. So that's up to you how you want to manage that. But this is where the content resides. Sometimes when you're having problems, you might be asked to delete your cache folder or the vault, which is the Fantasy Grounds version of the modules, but these are all encrypted. So you can't really do anything with them, but the vault is where all the downloads are stored for the official content. And then all these pictures are here are screenshots. So when you click on print screen, it will automatically place a photo of your screen in the Fantasy Grounds folder so you can retrieve it later if you want to show somebody something that's going on with Fantasy Grounds. So that's just where the content resides. But I'm going to go ahead and start this new campaign. And if you have any extensions or you're familiar with them, you can decide if you want to load those or not. The only one I can recommend, honestly, is the font extension, which just changes the font a little bit, just makes it a tiny bit bigger. That's about all it does. It doesn't really improve too much. And then for the password, I don't really need a password because I'm actually in my local area network. But when you want to host, you got to pick whether you want to be on a cloud, whether you're private or not, or if you're going to be connecting locally in your house, you can use LAN, and that's port 1802. And then you can also connect via the old method, how Fantasy Grounds used to work, which was to connect through a VPN, or you can connect through port forwarding. The only problem with that is if you have a newer IP address, it may not work. It has to be an IPv4 connection, not 6. So just depends. So once I've selected these extensions and the rule set, give it a title, and then how I want to connect, then I'm going to hit start. So while this is loading, there are some caveats about Fantasy Grounds that you should know. So in order to get comfortable and proficient with it, you actually have to use it. There's a lot of people who will go on and they'll look at it for 20 minutes and they don't like it, so they just, they never touch it again. So it really takes a little bit more than just 20 minutes to get your head wrapped around it. It really comes down to using it. Once you start using it, it actually starts becoming second nature. There are some things about it that aren't readily, they're not readily noticeable. They're not intuitive, but once you understand how the software is set up and how it works, you'll probably enjoy it more instead of just looking at it and throwing your hands up in the air and saying, "Oh, I don't get it." So this is the launch screen. This is what you'll be faced with when you first start Fantasy Grounds. So what this is assuming is that you're going to be setting up your new campaign, which is a session, in other words. So by doing this, when you hit next, it's actually going to take you to where your modules are and your data modules. So if you don't have anything, you haven't purchased anything except for maybe a license, you can click on the 5e SRD, which is free, that comes with Fantasy Grounds with the 5th edition rule set. So this is just confirming that they're loaded. And you can also load the 5e basic rules, which is really pared down version of the player's handbook. And it has a couple options in there. So you're really getting the bare minimum. I mean, there's hardly anything there. And if you have the core rules, you can load those instead. So you don't need both. A lot of this is redundant. But if you have like the monster manual, the player's handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide, you can load those instead. So if I click on these, this is going to load the main core rulebooks for this rule set, provided that you own them. So in this case, yes, I have them. And even if you only have just the player's handbook, it will still load that one. So you don't have to have all of them. It'll load if you want it to. And then you hit next. And then once you're done, it'll take you to the options where you can start setting up your game options depending on the rule set. And these vary a little bit between rule set to rule set, depending on what the capabilities are and how it's developed. So I'm going to go ahead and close this for right now. And if you don't want this campaign window to keep popping up every time you're in this particular campaign, you can click that little check mark, click finish, and it won't come back unless you want it to. And if you want it to come back, you come up here to options, which is where it kind of leaves you anyways. And you can click on setup and it will bring you back to the beginning of the campaign setup. So it kind of forms a loop. So once you go through all this, you go to here. If you close this, you can also bring that back up. So if you are a Fantasy Grounds user, you have an account, and you're a player or a GM, you can buy your own dice. So right now, this is the default color for the black dice down here. If you go to the interface where it says options, or excuse me, there's a dice icon, has its own icon. This is where you can change the color of your dice. You won't have access to all these other ones until you purchase them. These are actual different sets that you can buy from the store. You will get these elemental basics and then a skin default that you can color your own. So if I wanted to, I can change the color of these dice. So I'm going to click on body, and you can click around on this color picker thing. So I think I want like a bumblebee colored dice. So here's the yellow. And then if I want to confirm or keep the yellow, I can hit OK. You can also use the color dropper. So if you have this little dropper and you hover it around the rule set, I can grab the red from this text if I want to use that, or I can use this kind of beige color in the background. And then I have to hit OK. If you don't click OK, it won't accept or change it won't keep the changes. And then for text, I'm going to go with black, so I'll just go like that and hit OK. So that's just one way to do this. If you start buying your own fancy dice, you can actually use these presets, and then they'll have like a little animation with them, depending on which sets you have. So I think my favorite one for these, I believe it's this, which one is it? Yeah, the storm one. Or this, this is a magnetic storm. And it has like kind of a clear glow to it. And then they're starting to get into more graphically oriented ones, like the Chessex dice sets. Like you can have, this is like a base set for the wizard. And then there's the artificer one also, which is a different pattern. And what's kind of nice is some of these are customizable, some of these are preset, so you might be able to change the colors or you might be able to change the pattern, but in some of these you can't change them. They are what they are. But the one that has the little palette or the little wrench next to it, those are the ones that you can actually, or the little palette, it means you can recolor it. So if you didn't like that color, In this case, I will just go to the body color. Maybe I'll change that to purple, or like maybe a little darker blue. And then hit OK, and then go to text, maybe change that to yellow. So you can change those depending on what your needs are. But like I said, these don't come with the base program. Only these elemental basics and this recolored one. I don't remember if the metal ones do or not. I think that's a separate pack. But nonetheless, players have to buy their own dice. So if the GM buys these, the players also have to buy their own. So it just depends on your needs and such. So that's just a little bit about the dice. You can also change the size. So I have them at maximum size, but you can make them smaller or bigger depending on what you need. I usually have them around 110. That seems to be a good visibility on that. And then you can also remove dice. So if you don't want the D100 or the 4-sided, or you use a rule set that only uses 6s and 10s, you can actually cancel out these other ones and just keep those 2 dice. So it just depends on the rule set and what your needs are there. The other thing you can do with these custom dice rolls is when you get used to the interface and how the rules work, you can actually assign dice for different types of damage. So if you had a material that you wanted to assign to a certain type of damage, like for poison, it's this green dice here. For necrotic, it's the black dice. Lightning is kind of this violet. For force, it's purple. So you can actually customize the color of the dice for the type of damage that you want. But you have to own the dice, and then you also have to set it up. The DM can do so. And if the DM owns his own dice, the players will see that, but they won't be able to necessarily change or make theirs similarly. So they'll have to buy their own. So that's one of the few things that the players do have to buy. Everything else is, either a demo license or if you want, you can get a standard license. So that's just customizing the dice. You can modify some of the sizes of the window. So for instance, this chat window is locked, but you can actually right-click it, unlock it, and then drag it around with this bottom right corner, and that will resize the window. So that's something that you're going to have to do eventually. And most of the data windows do this. So if you're looking to change how the positioning of a window and how wide it is to manage your desktop space, that's how you do that. It's usually on the bottom right corner is where you manipulate that. Once you have it in place, you can actually lock this particular window. So I'm going to lock the position. That way I don't accidentally move it. If I want to clear the text on here and I don't want all this stuff, I can right-click and click on the eraser, and that will clear all that out. Or you can do a right/clear command in the text chat window and hit enter, and it will clear it as well. So there is a command function here. So if you do right/question mark and enter, these are all the right/ commands, or most of the more common ones. Up here on top, this is the combat tracker. So this would be something that you'd probably want to get set up, because this is where your NPCs and your players will be when you're playing. So I usually set that right about there. And then I will go into the options as the GM, and I can decide if we're going to use the dice tower or not. So where it says table dice tower, if I click that on, it turns this on, and it's locked over here in the corner. So I can right click, unlock it, and move it closer to the dice so I don't have to reach across the table for it. And then I'm going to resize the chat window and the combat tracker to kind of fit what I have set up here. So this will look a little bit cleaner and a lot more organized. And then I'm only using 1/3 of the desktop space. So that's important that you learn how to manage your desktop space, because it can get a little frustrating and annoying once you get started and you got 50,000 windows open. So one thing about the windows, when you first open them, so in other words, here's the library. If I click on modules, it's always going to show up in the center first. So if you don't want it to pop up in that location every single time, you can move it over here, and then I'll close it. And if I open that again, it's going to stay where I left it. So if you know that about Fantasy Grounds and its windows, it makes it that much easier to understand. So any new window is going to open in the center. If you don't want it to open in the center, you move it. You can change the sizing of it. So maybe you want it wider or more narrow, and then you want to locate it. Once you've done that and you close this window and you go ahead and pop it back up again, it's going to stay where you put it. You can even shortcut that. So if you wanted this modules window, you can left click and drag it down to the hotkeys. So when you start the content here, if you want to go back to modules quickly, you can actually just pop this up here. So you can open and close it from here a lot easier than trying to reach over here and look for it. So you can actually make a cheat sheet or a way to start up your table fairly quickly. So you could do that with a note. And then what I would do is just click on this green plus button, which adds a new note. And I'm going to put startup list just for my own sake and my own sanity. So what this will do is allow you to create links so that when you first come to Fantasy Grounds and you're starting it up for the day or before your session, I take the notes and I drag this little link on the left and put it down here in the hotkeys. So what this will allow me to do is any shortcuts that I want to open up in the beginning, I can do so. So I'm going to do the combat tracker, and this one I have to label. So there's the combat tracker. Here's the modules. I don't normally need to shortcut that, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyways. So this is the module shortcut. And then anything else that you can think of that you want to open up in the beginning of your session can go right there. So what will happen is I'll go ahead and size this. I'll put it down here for right now. I'll close all this stuff out. And when I come back, I should be able to pull up that stuff rather quickly. So I'm going to right click. This is how you exit Fantasy Grounds, by the way. So you right click, you go to exit session, and go to return to launcher. That's the proper way to exit Fantasy Grounds. If you just X out, you kind of have a minor risk of corrupting the data. If you were in the middle of something, it may not save it, that sort of thing. So once I've done that, if I want to go back to that session, let's say next week or something, I'll go to load campaign, and here's the new campaign that I've just created, and I'll hit start. And when I go back, those shortcuts down at the bottom will still be there. And those are what I'll refer to when I first come onto the table every time. That way I don't have to look for things. I'm not clicking 100 million different windows and moving stuff around. It can get really aggravating. So you want to get used to placing things where you want them to be in the beginning of your campaign, and then as you evolve in play and such, everything will be in its spot where it needs to go, and you're not having windows constantly covering other windows. And that's generally what people fight in the beginning, is they don't really understand how the windows work. So Fantasy Grounds has some, UI problems, and one of them is that people run out of desktop space and they don't quite understand how it works. So in this case, as you can see, it looks kind of blank. I don't have anything on right now. So if I bring up my notes at the bottom and then I click on the links that I made earlier, that's going to put everything where I wanted it to go. So it's going to stay where you left it. So if you make this something that you do every time when you start a new campaign, it's going to be a lot easier on you than trying to reinvent the wheel and then trying to manage all the windows. So that's something you want to kind of get set up towards the beginning of your experience with Fantasy Grounds. And now here are all the books in the module library. I'm going to go ahead and move this over to the center so it's more focused. I would normally leave it there. But if you want to activate a module, you can go to activation. And what will happen is you can come into the rule set filter and only filter to the D&D rule set, or the load filter, which will only show the modules that are loaded. So if I already have the main books, I don't need the basic rules in the SRD. If I don't have any of the content, I can use the basic in the SRD to kind of get a feel for what's happening in Fantasy Grounds and how it interfaces, but it's very limited. You don't have very many character options. It is very, very minimal. So this is just going to give you a kind of a rough idea of what it looks like. So if I unload all of the main content, so that would be the player's handbook, the monster manual, and the dungeon master's guide, that's what I'd be left with. This is what you're getting when you first start Fantasy Grounds, without buying any modules. You also have a calendar that you can employ. So the calendar comes with basically it comes with Unity. So you can load the calendars module, which will give you an option to add a calendar to your game. There's also some quick start maps. If you go to Fantasy Grounds map or FG map, or let me go with battle maps. Maybe that's what it's called. I don't remember. But there is a map pack that comes with Fantasy Grounds. Let's see, map. Yeah, so there is a map pack that comes with Fantasy Grounds. Nothing fancy, but it's called FG Battle Map, so you can load that to kind of get an idea of what you're getting. And that's pretty much the majority of the standard stuff that comes with the D&D 5e rule set. Not all rule sets come with the core rules or the base rules. Just depends on which one. I think Pathfinder 1 comes with a kind of a core rule book. I don't remember if Pathfinder 2 does. But nonetheless, don't always expect the same exact thing between each rule set. There are some slight variations depending on license and how it's developed. So now that I have all these modules loaded, now what I'm going to try to do, I don't know how it's going to work, is I'm going to try to build a character. So there are two different ways to build characters in Fantasy Grounds. So when you click on player and then this is characters, it'll be blank usually unless you've bought one of the starter modules where you can add your own presets that'll come with the modules. But in this case, you're starting from scratch with nothing. So you can use the character wizard, which pulls on the content that you have loaded. And you want to have the content shared and loaded before you start the character wizard. If you do it halfway through building this character, it's not going to pull in those changes. So you want to make sure that you have those available before you start the wizard. The other method is the old drag and drop method, which is just to create a new or add item or create a new character. So there are two different ways to build a character. This way is the older way with the drag and drop method. This one over here is a character wizard, which kind of automates some of these steps, kind of makes it a little bit faster, and you're not digging through the menu over here, which has a lot of your options for character builder. So under character, these are where all the goodies are. There are some good things and bad things. So one thing I don't like about the character wizard is you don't learn Fantasy Grounds. You're basically just picking stuff from a list and you're not really learning where all this stuff is. When you build it the manual way, it takes longer. It's a little bit more aggravating at times, and there's more risk for choosing or dragging over the wrong stuff. But it gives you a better idea of how Fantasy Grounds works. So there's two different schools of thought on it. I don't mind either way. I've timed myself with both methods of creation. And generally, I save maybe anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes on character creation, depending on the type of character. Like wizards, I probably save maybe 15 minutes or so. For a fighter, maybe 5 minutes. So it just depends on what you're building. But I'm going to go ahead and use the character wizard. And this is the quick and dirty way to do this. So you have different resources here that you're going to be pulling on. And some of this is redundant. So you have to be careful which content in this case you're going to be pulling from. And like I said, the basic rules and the actual Fantasy Grounds SRD for the 5th edition rule set, they're not complete, so you're not going to have a lot of options. So I know from experience that I can build a Dwarven Cleric pretty thoroughly without needing all the rules. But all the other character types or races and such, I won't have access to because I don't have any of the official books loaded. So these are official, but they're very pared down. There's no art, not very many options, so you're really going to be limited. But I'm going to go ahead and pick a dwarf because I know that this is fairly complete through the basic rules. So I'm going to pick a hill dwarf. and that satisfies some of the racial stuff, but I got to pick a tool. So down here at the bottom, it's asking me to select a tool proficiency for my racial background. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Smith's tools. So I'll be proficient with Smith's tools, and then I'll come over here to class. And I'm going to pick a cleric because I know that the cleric is a little bit more defined and detailed with options for the basic rules in the SRD, whereas the other classes and race, not so much. So here I can pick some proficiencies. So I get light armor, medium armor, shields, and simple weapons. So I'm going to select a skill first. So I'm going to go with history, and I think I'm going to go with medicine. Yeah, medicine and history. And then for my divine domain, I'm going to pick the life domain. That's the only option I have. But if you had a bunch of other books and stuff, you'd have more options. And then you have the spell casting where it defines what you get and how it works. So this is just the class part. Now for the abilities. So when you want to make or generate ability scores, you can override them down here at the bottom. If there are any miscellaneous adjustments that you want to add as the GM, maybe you're going to give your group +1 to any ability score. And then the ASI is the ability score increase if you chose one at level 4. And then for the racial bonus, you can see I'm getting a +2 on con and a +1 on wisdom, so it updates this so I have an idea of where to assign my other points. And then the method of choosing, you can do manual entry or roll. You can do a point buy where it will deduct from this 27 points. And then you have the standard array, which is what basic D&D suggests, or like Adventurers League. So this is just a balanced way to assign this, and then you can move these around if you want. So if you wanted strength for dexterity, you can just drag and drop and swap these out as required. So I might want my 13 there. Charisma I don't really care about. This one's going to be my dump stat. Or if you don't like that, you can always roll. So I'm going to do the dice roll manual entry. I can go ahead and click on the die. It'll roll a whole bunch of these. What it does is it rolls 4d6, drops the lowest. So these are the new scores that are updated. If you don't like it, maybe your DM will let you roll 3 sets, depending on what's going on with you. And maybe I want this charisma to be in wisdom, and then maybe this score to go to charisma. And I kind of like this actually, so I'm going to go with move my con over there, and looks pretty good. I'm going to move my dexterity over there. So that's a decent start for a first level cleric. So I got 14, 13, 16 for con, 12 for intelligence, 16 for wisdom, and 10 for charisma. So that's not too bad. So you can move these numbers around under the base part by just left clicking and dragging and moving it, swapping it with another score. So it just depends on what you want to do for character creation, what your GM allows. But this is essentially what it rolls the die and it drops the lowest. You can also manually do this with a command in the chat window. So now that I have the ability scores, now I can go to background. So I'm going to pick a background that's based on the content I have loaded. So I'm going to go with a soldier. I think at one time this individual was, in a war or something like that. And then I can pick another tool proficiency from my background. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and pick a dragon chest set. That may have been something I learned and picked up in my pastimes, maybe occasionally join a tournament, something like that. Then it discusses my military rank, if I had one, and then any skills that I want to switch or pick. So this gives me athletics and intimidation. I'm fine with that, but if you wanted to switch them, you really could, but this is what the background gives you. And then for equipment, you can either use a starting kit for your class and background, or you can start with wealth to purchase your content. For quickness and for ease of use, I'm going to use starting select kit, and that just gives me the cleric set. I'm going to actually get a dragon chest set, so I'll actually have one in my possession. I'm going to go with the warhammer for my first choice, and then for my second choice, I'm going to pick probably chainmail or scale mail for my armor. And then for my second weapon, and in order to kind of have a ranged weapon, I'm going to pick a light crossbow. I will pick the Explorer's Pack over the Priest Pack because for adventuring and such. And then for my holy symbol, I can decide what I want. I'm going to do a reliquary. And then that's basically the base equipment. And then if you wanted to buy some other things, you can click on this little plus button. You can search for things. You can filter it by gear, weapons, or armor. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look for some bolts because I don't know if you get crossbow bolts or not. And I click the down arrow, and that's going to add it to my inventory. And then that's pretty much it. I don't really need much else. That's just the ammunition. Other than that, I don't think I need much else, but I do want to get a smith kit so I can smith tools in case I want to use those. So just because you're proficient doesn't necessarily mean you get those, but I'm going to add those to my equipment. So that's pretty much all I need right now. And maybe my GM is a nice person and he wants us to live. So I get 1 potion of healing. So I'm just going to type healing and I'm going to add that to the inventory. So now that I have this, I'm going to click the down arrow. That's going to add it to my inventory. So that's just a way to manually override or to add things as you need them. So then once I get done with that, I can go back and review. If you click on the commit button, it allows you to basically get an overview of the content that you have and the stuff that you picked. And if you're not happy with it, this is the time to go back and make changes. Because once you click on commit and you type save, you're pretty much stuck with that build. So I'm going to go ahead and type level 1 dwarf soldier cleric. And that way, if I ever want to use this, I already have one set up. And I don't have to go looking through all of the characters just to figure out which one it is. So it's nice to have this labeled. You don't even have to put level 1 because it already shows that. So I'm just going to say dwarf soldier cleric. And I'm going to hit save. And once it saves, now you are at the character sheet. And this is generally where I put my character sheet when I'm setting up the table. And then I'm going to assign a portrait. So if I would click on portrait, and I'll navigate to one of the packs in here. There's a Fantasy Grounds fantasy pack that has a bunch of fantasy kind of base things. And I'm just going to grab one of the dwarves that's in the pack. It usually takes a few seconds to load because it's got to scan through all these images and build this thumbnail. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this dwarf that has a helm on. And that's essentially the main part of the build. So the character's filled out, the armor class is updated. I have the hill dwarf. Here are some of my skills. Now, if I want to add any of those other skills, like the crafting skills, I can click on this green plus button a couple times, put this star on there, which means that I'm proficient with it, and then pick manually type it in. So this is going to be Smith's tools. And you would rarely use these, but if you had to make like a repair check, or if you were doing some downtime activity and you were building content with your smith tools, that might be something your DM would have you roll. And then I'm going to put it on wisdom as my highest score. It kind of makes sense. And then the other one was the chess set. So I'm just going to put chess and I'll put that as wisdom as well. So those are just kind of minor proficiencies, and I'm just adding those manually in case. But this is the dragon chess, and the other one was for the tool. So there's dragon chess and the tool. So I added those manually. I doubt I'll ever use them, but you never know. And then for your abilities, it kind of just lists what these are. In some cases, not every little single thing is going to be detailed or listed on here, and you do have to click on these to read what they do. So bonus proficiency here, it says when you choose this domain at first level, you gain proficiency with heavy armor. Now, it doesn't have the logic to actually add that as you would hope. So I'm going to have to type that in on the proficiencies. So that way, if I wear heavy armor, I'm not going to be penalized and I'm going to be proficient with it. So I'm going to do heavy armor. because that is something that I get with this particular, it's a bonus proficiency. So if I don't put heavy armor on here and I go to put some on, you're going to get bonus, or excuse me, you're not going to get your benefits from it. You're going to end up having problems. So heavy armor. So that signifies that I am proficient with it. So you have to add those in occasionally if they're not added automatically. So discipline of life, it says that at first level, your healing spells are more effective. When you use a spell of first level or greater, so not bonus spells, or excuse me, not cantrips, you get to add 2 plus the spell's level to the effective number for healing. So that's something we can do later when we get our spells picked, but I'm going to leave this up so I remember to go back to it. Divine Domain just kind of gives you an idea that you have the ability to have a domain. And then there's the Disciple of Life, which we've already did, but this is something that we already did, the bonus proficiency Disciple of Life. So military rank kind of just reiterates and confirms your military background. And then here's the spellcasting definition. So this just defines the spells that you're going to be getting. But what I don't see here are the bonus spells. I think maybe the actual life domain is kind of, it's not constant. It's not put in here as what like I thought. Disciple of Life is, and the bonus proficiency, but I don't see the domain spells for it. Oh, here it is. So domain spells. Yeah, it says you might get additional domain spells. So when you actually have the content, it'll list them here sometimes, but you'll have to often take and look at the class. So if you go to the class description over here under the class, you actually click on the life domain, it will give you an idea of the bonus spells that you get. So what you could do in this case, I don't know if it'll let you, but you can drag this over or just take these notes and add it to one of these, make your own. And these are your bonus spells. So I'm going to keep that open because when I go to pick spells, I'm going to want to know which ones I get and which ones are I don't need to worry about, because these don't count as your daily total. They're always in your repertoire of spells. And here's the Dwarven Resilience. So you have saving throws against, you have a bonus advantage on saving throws, and you have resistance against poison damage. So those are something that you might have to put in your character sheet depending on how it's automated. Your speed is just a notation. You move 25 feet. Stone Cunning is a intelligence history check related to stonework. You are considered proficient in history skill and add double your proficiency bonus to check instead of your normal. So what you could do with that is, if one way around this is you can go to skill, and I'm going to make one called stonework. It's based on history, so it's going to be wisdom, but I'm just going to call it stonework. And then what I'll do is I'll change this to wisdom. And then it says double, so I'm going to click on the star again, and that's going to give me double the proficiency bonus. So that's one way you can do it to kind of handle. So anything related to stonework, you use this skill instead of history. So then once you have done that, then you can go and fill out your race and your background notes here. Personality traits, if you don't have any of your own, you can click on the soldier and scroll down towards the bottom, and you have these tables that you can roll on. So if you wanted to pick them or roll, you can. So if I go back to my notes and I go to the personality traits, pull this up, you can have up to 2 of these. So you can either roll. So this says, face problems head on. A simple, direct solution is the best path to success. I think that's fitting. So he dragged this information up onto the character sheet. You don't have to type it. But if I wanted to pick one, I can also put, I'm haunted by the memories of war. I can't get the images of violence out of my mind, or I've lost so many friends and I'm slow to make new ones. So that may be one. So I put that there. You just drag it onto the sheet. You don't have to roll it. You can just kind of do that. You can go down that list and do all those things accordingly if you want to. And then you have your notes down here that you can keep adding to if you want. The log is for Adventures League. So if you play in Adventures League, this is where you would record that information. And then for your actual character here, I'm going to put 20 for my slots here. And then I get a dagger. So I'll just put 1 here. And then the Warhammer is something I chose. So the Warhammer has a couple different functionalities. If you use it two-handed, it does more damage, but you're not supposed to benefit from the shield bonus. So you have to unequip the shield if you're going to use that two-handedly. But a lot of people forget that. But nonetheless, that's just something that you'll have to get used to. And then here are some of the actions already set up for us. So in some cases, Fantasy Grounds is set up to parse and to put these in as an effect. So if I change the bottom down here to preparation and then combat or actions, so combat actions, this adds a note or an effect, so I don't need to use that skill that I allocated. And then for Dwarven Resilience, you can add that to your character. So if your character's on the combat tracker, you would enable that so that when you are playing, this is automatically on. And if you come across poison, it'll help you remember that you have advantage on the saving throw, and you have resist poison, which will reduce the amount of damage. And then your additional healing, Disciple of Life, is right here. It's +3. So you can add this in either as a bonus on your spell, or you can just leave it as this additional heal. But that'll take 2 actions instead of just 1 in regards to dragging it to the heal function. And then if I want to grab some spells, I come over here to the right, go to the spells area, or I could have done it in the interface where I could have went to the class and did it there. But I kind of like doing it here. I got a better view of what I'm getting. And this is kind of like the older method. So if I go to 0 level and then source, I'm going to filter it just to cleric. This is what I'm going to add to the sheet. So I'm going to go with guidance, which is a really helpful spell. And you get 3 of those, I believe. I'm going to go with sacred, or actually light. Light seems to be a good spell. And then maybe spare the dying. So these are my cantrips. So those are all set to go. And now that I have those ready, all I have to do is collapse it so I don't have an expanded list. So those are just cantrips. Now I can go to my first level spell. And what I'm going to do is first I'm going to grab my domain. So I get Bless and Cure Wound. So I'm going to take the Bless part, and I'm actually going to drag it to the cleric actions or the domain stuff because I don't want them mixed in with the regular spells. And then I'm going to do Cure Wounds. So what this is going to do is differentiate what my bonus spells are from the actual spells that I can, memorize for the day or I can prepare. So those will always be prepared essentially. And then up here on the top, I want to change this to Wisdom because most of my stuff is based on Wisdom. So that way, if there's anything Wisdom based, it will update here. So why did I pick Bane? I don't get Bane. So I grabbed the wrong one. There we go. So here's Bless. All right, so those are my domain spells and my domain abilities. I also have one called Turn Undead, but I won't worry about that. But that's another thing I'd probably add here. And then whatever your domain, Disciple of Life is part of that too. So now that I have that, I'm going to start picking the other ones. So I'm going to go with Guiding Bolt. That's one of my favorites. Healing Word. And a couple others. So I will go with Command, and let's go with Sanctuary or Protection from Good and Evil. So that's a pretty good start. You can actually add all these if you want to as a cleric, but in regards to your spells and what you want to prepare in that, you don't have to add all of them, but you can certainly go back in and reassign them because clerics are a little bit more freedom as opposed to wizard. So anyway, so those are all of my spells. And then when you want to prepare them, you go to preparation mode and group, and then you can click on this little magnifying glass and just put any number you want in here. So I just might put a 1 or something in there. And then what this will do is give you the ability to prepare these spells. And then you go back to combat and actions, and these are the ones that are prepared. And then there you go. So that's pretty much a majority of that build. So this is just a way that you can customize your character and kind of get started in Fantasy Grounds. So these are a little bit more advanced steps, but at least you'll have an idea of what you're facing. So you get an account. You either connect to someone who has the books, or you get your own books for character creation. And then from there, you can decide, how far you want to get into it. But I think I've been rambling for about an hour or so, so I think I'm going to end the stream. Hopefully this is kind of helpful to some of you. I know I went over just like the D&D character creation, but a lot of the other rule sets have like a character wizard that's very similar. You have to kind of be familiar with it, or at least be willing to learn it in order to get better with it. And then also just remember, if you have a Steam account, you need to connect it with Fantasy Grounds and those sort of things. So take care, everyone.